huge topic that I really struggle to condense into one session, so we'll see how we go. A kind of brief history of feminism in the traditional way. The history of feminism is normally split up into 3 waves, like 3 sections. The first wave concerns the late 19th century, women trying to get the vote, the suffragettes, like the early 20th century. And this is seen as kind of the legal political wave, where women, were trying to get legal and political rights. The second wave is seen to be later in the 20th century, in the 1970s, by which point many women now had the vote in Europe, and instead of fighting for legal and political rights, they started fighting for social things, marriage, beauty, anything that comes under kind of more cultural, societal effects. And we'll go into that, because the second wave feminist movement is seen to be the moment when feminist art really emerged. The third wave of feminism is like what we're in now, and it's defined in many different ways, but one of the ways in which it's distinguished is a more intersectional approach. Intersectional is a word that was first used in 1979 by an African-American woman called Kimberly Crenshaw, and she basically said that feminism needs to be more intersectional, i.e. it needs to take into account more of the different cross-sections of different types of discrimination, like gender combined with race, or with disability, or with class, and it was a kind of attempt to move away from what had started to be called white middle class feminism. There is still lots of white middle class feminism around today, but the idea is that in the third wave we've become, or are trying to become, more conscious of this issue. So those are the 3 rough definitions of the history of feminism. The feminist art movement, like I said, is thought to have started in the 1970s. So let me show you this here. This is some examples of the more social concerns that women had. Things like being confined to the kitchen, the concept of the housewife, the idea that you had to have kids, the idea that girls should be brought up differently to boys. You know, these were more sort of psychological concerns, as opposed to trying to get the right to vote. And these works of art that I'm showing you, this one, Preparing for a Facelift, and this is another series by a Russian artist that's all about makeup and kind of the ugly truth behind makeup. I'm going through these quite quickly because we will come back to them. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what second wave feminism was concerned with and how art responded to these concerns. The question, I suppose, is like, why now? So why did the 1970s kind of explode like this? Why did feminist art emerge in this period? There are many answers, but one of the ones that I like, this is another example of the same Russian artist who is talking about plastic surgery and beauty, which was another big concern of the second wave feminist movement. One of the reasons for this kind of explosion in feminist art, I'm going to skip these actually, is because of advertising. And I have this collection of adverts, which I'll scroll through really quickly because you'll see how many there are, of makeup adverts essentially from the 20th century, all of which include men, who I've helpfully highlighted, essentially to show you that things like makeup were really being pitched as something for a man, even though a woman was wearing it. I mean, oh my God, this advert, it speaks for itself. And you get the idea that suddenly women were just bombarded with images. I've given you a short selection of makeup related images. But when you see just how much of this visual, colorful content there suddenly was in the 20th century, you get an idea of why artists felt the need to respond. There's a really good program on the BBC at the moment called Age of the Image. I'm not sure if anyone's watching it. But it basically talks about how images just exploded in the 20th century, and we were suddenly confronted with more media than ever before. And makeup is just kind of one example of this. I love to include this image, which is from 1930, and it's a contraption, a beauty contraption, invented by Max Factor, the man himself, for women. So some of these things really were, and still are in some cases, totally ridiculous. So when you look at the context that women were facing in the 20th century and the feminist art that they produced, it kind of makes sense that they would just explode and feel the need to respond to the amount of sexist advertising that they were seeing suddenly. It's just kind of one explanation for the proliferation of images. I wanted to mention at the beginning, which I skipped past so we could look at the adverts, that of course, despite this kind of first wave, second wave, third wave feminist history and the association of feminist art history with the 1970s primarily, there were, of course, women artists before this period, most famously Artemisia Gentileschi, and she has a big exhibition at the moment, I think, in the National Gallery. I won't go into her. There's also Kathy Kollwitz, who I wanted to include in case anyone was looking for a woman printmaker, because I know it was quite a male-heavy week with the prints, but she is a really amazing printmaker who was really scarred by World War I and lost a son, and her prints are really worth looking at if anyone's interested. And we've also looked at we've looked at lots of women artists before who predate the feminist art movement, like Hannah Hock. But the point of the feminist art movement is that it's the first moment in which women were labeling themselves feminist artists. Not women artists, not surrealists or whatever, but actually feminist artists. So that's why it's a kind of important moment. So I'll skip past these hilarious makeup adverts again. I love this collection. And we are going to start with the American feminist art movement of the 1970s, because traditional histories of feminist art sadly always start in the US. And I think it's important to kind of quickly cover the traditional history so that you can then compare it to everything that was missed out. So traditional feminist art histories start in 1970s. It was a very politically charged context with the Vietnam War, with the Civil Rights Movement, and women were kind of activated by this. They were also activated by a number of important texts. So American women were reading Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which had come out in 1953. And they were also reading this book that we're looking at now called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedman. And it was published in 1963. And it was about the social, emotional, personal dissatisfaction of women. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from this. Each suburban wife struggles with it alone. as she makes the beds, shops for the groceries, matches slipcover material, eats peanut butter sandwiches with her children, takes them to Brownies, lays beside her husband at night. She's afraid to ask herself the silent question, is this all? And I mean, now this argument is very outdated because there's a lot of feminist texts that say that you shouldn't shame housewives or talk about it as if it's not enough. But at the time, it was really your only option as a woman, and for many women, it wasn't a choice. So that's the context that this book came out of. I just thought it was interesting to include this article about the many different covers that this very iconic feminist text has seen, which I think is interesting. The history of art of book covers is really interesting because publishers often respond to the political context. So when you look at these book covers, you can kind of tell how fashionable feminism was or wasn't at the time that the book was being sold. So sometimes you really go out there with the book cover and you put a kind of Botticelli's Venus on with a quote from inside the book that's really radical, and other times you make it kind of look like a sort of feminine novel that's not political at all. So that's an interesting article. I've included the link if anyone wants to match the dates with the covers, which is interesting to do. Okay, I shouldn't go on tangents, but there's also interesting studies done on the relationship between the development of the AIDS epidemic and the book covers of gay novels, and like how gay they were made to look depending on how bad the crisis was. So it's really interesting and always worth thinking about next time you go into a bookstore. So in this kind of Betty Friedman 1970s American context, this woman artist, Judy Chicago, stormed the feminist art scene, kind of created it. On the left, it's her as a young woman, and on the right, it's her now. She is famous for kind of doing these self-portraits in a boxing ring. She established a feminist art program. So she kind of coined the term feminist art in 1970 in Chicago. And she invited women artists to come and define themselves as feminist artists. And they did what she called consciousness raising sessions, which were sessions where women would sit in a circle and talk about, I don't really know how to describe it, talk about their problems without trivializing it, and kind of try and piece together what similar things they were going through, what things might be socially imposed, and to try and kind of escape them together. There's lots written about these consciousness raising sessions. In terms of the art that they produced, the most famous thing is, the most famous installation is called Womanhouse, from 1972, which was divided into different rooms, and each artist, different groups of artists took different rooms on and filled them with feminist kind of installations, which I've got some examples here. There are some really interesting comments coming up on the chat. Someone saying that things like consciousness raising sessions were about trying to find one's identity in a way that was not defined by men. Exactly. And that was actually the point of having spaces that were kind of women only. And actually with Womanhouse, on the very first day, they only allowed women to visit the installation. And apparently there was a queue of 10,000 people, and it was this huge, sensational event. And they said women were the only ones who were allowed to go, which was hugely controversial. I mean, to be honest, it's still controversial to have women-only spaces, because people say that, now people say it's exclusive for lots of different reasons, because you're not including trans people, for example. But at the time, the idea that you wouldn't include men, and even still today, people get angry about this. So it was really radical. Someone else has said on the group that these early feminist art images were about locating women in domesticity, which is another great point, because you can see in this first Womanhouse installation that women were really parodying the relationship between women and domesticity. They were really trying to like laugh at it and turn it into a mockery. The egg, you can see this kitchen is covered in fried eggs, was a really important feminist symbol in the West. If you type in fried egg feminist art, it's amazing how much stuff comes up. They loved it. They absolutely loved it. They used it as a symbol of birth, of this obsession with women giving birth, a symbol of something that was kind of essential but easy to break, which they felt encompassed women. They used it as a symbol of something that looked like a woman's breast. They used it, oh my God, for all these different reasons that we also discussed actually when we were looking at Velázquez's painting of a woman frying eggs, which that was in the Spanish Art Week. So anyway, I have mentioned this before, but this is, you know, a great example of a fried egg feminist work of art. There were other things in Womanhouse. If you want to, there's a great book just actually dedicated to, it's kind of like a photo book about all of the Womanhouse installations. They had like a menstruation bathroom. They had a bridal staircase. They had tons of things. It's a great moment in feminist art history, to be honest. So one of the important points of Womanhouse is that it was a collaborative work. Even though Judy Chicago kind of steals the show, it was meant to be this huge collaboration between different women, everyone working together, and that was very purposeful. Because feminist art, one of its most important principles in the 1970s was collaboration. And it's best explained in this essay that we're looking at by Linda Nochlin, who, from 1971, like you can see, who is the same woman who wrote The Imaginary Orient, which we looked at in our Orientalist painting session. So she really is a great, you know, really prominent art historian. We'll spend some time on this essay because if you look into feminist art by yourself, it always comes up. She starts the essay by saying that feminist art historians should not desperately try and rediscover women artists from the past, like the ones we looked at the beginning of this class, like Artemisia Gentileschi, for example. She says that that is futile because, actually, I'm just going to quote her because I'll never be able to explain it as well as she has. So this is a long quote, but it's worth it. The fact of the matter is that there have been no supremely great women artists, as far as we know, although there may have been many interesting and very good ones who remain insufficiently investigated. But nor have there been any great Lithuanian jazz pianists or Eskimo tennis players, no matter how much we wish there may have been. That this should be the case is regrettable, but no amount of manipulating the historical or critical evidence will alter the situation, nor will accusations of male-chauvinist distortion of history. The fact, dear sisters, is that there are no women equivalents for Michelangelo or Rembrandt, Delacroix or Cézanne, Picasso or Matisse, or even in very recent times de Kooning or Warhol, any more than there are Black American equivalents for the same. So when you first read this essay, it's kind of like you're thinking maybe she's a misogynist, but she goes on to explain that the thing we should be studying is actually the reason why there are no great women artists or no great Black artists. And she says that you need to look at the historical evidence. For example, the slave trade, which would have hugely affected anyone's ability to be an artist, or in the case of women, the fact that they weren't allowed into academies, the fact that they weren't allowed to do life drawing because it wasn't proper for women to see naked bodies, the fact that they had no economic independence, so they couldn't buy themselves materials, the fact that they were, forced to stay at home and look after their kids and weren't allowed to, really weren't encouraged to go and seek artistic inspiration. So this is her first point. She says that, we have to, you know, she basically says it's not enough to just try and find women. The point is to try and find the reasons why the women aren't there. And she also says that we have to actually redefine what we define art to be. Worst phrase sentence ever. We have to think critically about our definition of art, basically, because everything we associate with art is actually something that's associated with a white man, like with something that has always been accessible to a white man, like oil painting and huge frescoes and sculpture, you know, things that have been more accessible to other people, like textiles, ceramics, carpet making, embroidery, are things that quite uncoincidentally we haven't elevated as these huge works of art. So anyway, this is a great essay. I'll just read one more quote and then we can leave this behind. She says, "The fault, dear brothers, lies not in our stars, not in our hormones, our menstrual cycles, or in our empty internal spaces, but rather in our institutions and our education." So it's a really great essay that's worth reading and really freely accessible online. So going back to Judy Chicago, this is her most famous work that we're looking at. It's called The Dinner Party. It's in the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And it's like a feminist reimagination of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So there are 39 ceramic embroidered plates, and they sit on 999 tiles. And each tile has the name of women throughout history. And each plate is also dedicated to a kind of historical woman, like Virginia Woolf has a plate, and no other names are coming to mind, but yeah, you can look at all of the different plates individually online. So immediately you can see that this work was all about doing what Linda Nochlin said and reclaiming textiles, you know, reclaiming collaborative work. There were huge groups of women working on this, trying to undermine the idea that you had to be this kind of individual male genius working alone, really tortured to be a famous artist, which we've talked about in this class before, is kind of a myth anyway. So yeah, so it's a mix of different, what would you call it, media, a mix of different media. And obviously, well, quite obviously, all of the plate shapes are abstract, but inspired by female genitalia. So it was a very provocative work, and it was totally sensational. It toured around America, it toured around Europe. It really became like the most famous feminist work of art in the West for a really, really long time. But pretty soon after this work went viral or became really famous, criticisms emerged. So one art historian called Alice Walker pointed out that only one of the 39 dinner plates was dedicated to a woman of color. And it was an African-American woman called Susana Truth. So Sugiyama Truth is a really, really important woman in American history, because she was the first woman freed from slavery to win a case against a white man. And essentially she escaped slavery with her daughter in 1826, escaped from one of the southern states up to the north. And when she was free, she went to court because she hadn't been able to take her son with her. And she won against the white slave master and actually won custody over her son. And she was the first Black woman in the US to do this. So she's hugely famous. She's also famous because when she was free, she actually started taking photographs of herself. So using this really new technology to make these small postcards of herself, which she would then disseminate to try and garner sympathy for the abolition movement. And she actually became the most photographed American woman of the 19th century, which is amazing. And her most famous speech is called "Ain't I a Woman?" And this phrase, "Ain't I a Woman?" became really, really, really important for African American feminists, because for them it basically encapsulated how they felt about the fact that the feminist movement, which was supposedly all about women, was not including them and therefore not treating them like they were also women. So a good example of this is if we go back to Betty Friedman's The Feminine Mystique, which is the text that we started with. I gave an excerpt from it and said that it's a book for housewives. And what many African American women said is that they actually didn't have the luxury historically or contemporaneously, if that's a word, of being housewives, because their ancestors had, their female ancestors had to work on the plantations like men. And there were still many plantations in the South that were paying their workers nothing. So they actually, when you conjure up a picture of a 1950s housewife, which is the person who Betty Friedman was writing for, the stereotype means that you don't picture a Black woman. So they were saying that actually we don't resonate with this feminism. They also were saying we don't resonate with this feminism that's trying to pick apart the makeup industry, because we're not even included in the makeup industry. No one makes foundation in our color. No one makes shades for our skin tones. So they were saying that this relationship that white women had begun to unpick between domesticity and women was there, but it was colorblind, and it didn't, acknowledge the fact that this wasn't the experience of all women. And one of the best examples of this friction between white feminism, white American feminism in this case, and African American feminism, is this work of art by Bettier Sars. It's not from the 1970s, but it's just so good. She turns her iron into, she pastes a diagram of a slave ship onto her iron. And you have to understand that many white women were making works of art with domestic appliances to try and parody this relationship really effectively. But what SARS exposes is the fact that there is this huge thing between African American women and their domesticity, which is the history of the slave trade, which couldn't be ignored. So this is a really important feminist work of art, which kind of comments on the exclusion of African American women from what was beginning to be labeled white feminism. So staying on this topic and going back to the representation of Sugiyama Truth in Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, you can kind of begin to understand why it was criticized for completely ignoring the experience of African American women, and quite tokenistically including this African, quite generic African print inspired plate of Sugiyama Truth. There are many problems with it, and one of the problems that Alice Walker pointed out is that it's actually the only plate in the whole series that isn't inspired by female genitalia and that actually represents the face of a woman. And Alice Walker makes this whole argument that it's because white feminism didn't perceive Black women as women, so it didn't kind of afford them this kind of symbol of womanhood. So it's an essay that really highlights the friction that was developing. The other issue with this plate is that whichever artist painted it, shows this woman crying and weeping. And what's interesting is that Susana Truth was very aware of the importance of representation, and especially the importance of representation for marginalized communities. So she was very specific and very calculated with what she did. And she made herself look like a very able, very well-mannered, well-dressed woman. And that becomes especially clear when you see some of the other portraits of slaves that were being circulated by the abolitionist movement, which tried to incite pity by showing scars and really, brutalized bodies. Sugiyama Truth was not taking part in that and refused to show herself as a victim because she wanted to show herself as, like her speech says, ain't I a woman? Like a really dignified person. So she would be horrified to see herself associated with such a sad image when she went through so much to try and represent herself as the opposite. So yeah, this is a really important controversy about Judy Chicago and the dinner party. The response of African-American feminist artists was huge. Like, the canon of work that I could have shown was totally, is quite overwhelming, really, and it's something that deserves a whole session in its own right. Like, this is a series called From the Kitchen Table by Carrie Mae Weems, which is kind of another response to Leonardo's dinner party. I really love the ways in which feminist artists have taken the concept of a dinner table and made it really political and interesting. So this is a African-American take, or her African-American take. And you can see as well that we started with images of the beauty industry. But here you can see her commenting on African-American hair texture, which was a really political subject for the Black feminist movement. And it's such a beautiful, really intimate series. I can't remember how many, there must be like maybe 15 of them. And it's full of really rich symbolism, like the empty bird cage in the background, the portraits of Martin Luther King in the background. I didn't think I've included an example, but he also appears. So I had to include this because it's my favorite, but I also couldn't not include Faith Ringgold, who is probably the most famous African-American feminist artist, and she's most famous for her tapestries. I couldn't pick one. She does lots of tapestries about the history of the slave trade, but she also does lots about contemporary life for African Americans then and now in more contemporary times. Because I couldn't choose with Faith Ringgold, I decided to focus on this painting and zoom in. I guess this is the first one that we'll spend some proper time with and do a bit of visual analysis, because it's just been exhibited in the MoMA. It's become now part of the permanent collection. It's exhibited in the room alongside Picasso's huge Demoiselle, which is in the MoMA as well, because it's inspired by Picasso's Guernica in terms of the composition and the color scheme a bit. So it's interesting that the MoMA, the MoMA is doing this feminist rehang to try and incorporate more women and Black artists and non-Western artists in its collection. And it's interesting to watch the progress of it. So this is one of the things that they've done. And it's crazy to think that this would have been in storage otherwise. But yeah, this this work of art is about the race riots that were going on at the time. And the point of it is that no one is free from the effects of these race riots. Whether you're black, whether you're white, whether you work in an office and you wear a suit and you're really well off, no one is free from it. And it's definitely, you know, of course, white people were not affected in the same way as black people by the race riots. That's not what Faith Ringgold was trying to say. She was trying to combat this idea that race was a black people's problem, which was something that critics of the civil rights movement were saying, that race was a black people's problem. And, you know, lots of African Americans were responding by saying, no, it's not. It's actually a white people's problem. It's a problem of racists, you know. So she was trying to make this idea visual in some way. There's a really famous quote, let me get it right actually, by Angela Davis, who was a really important activist in the civil rights movement. And she still gives amazing lectures today, and she's written lots of books on prison abolition and all these things that became really important to the African American feminist movement. And she wrote a letter to James Baldwin, who had been imprisoned for his civil rights work. And she said, if they come for you in the morning, they will come for me in the night. And this quote became really important because for the feminist movement, because the idea was that even if this doesn't affect you directly, or even if this doesn't affect you as badly as it affects me, if you passively accept this horrible culture, it will get you one day. That's such a butchering of Angela Davis's words, but I feel like that quote really relates to what this painting is trying to say. It's interesting that this painting is so gory and so bloody, because Picasso is said to have wanted to include some blood, like some red, in this Guernica painting, which for those who haven't seen it is huge. It's like 2 meters tall or more. It's in Madrid, and it goes across, yeah, it's probably the height of 2 people. And he's said to have wanted to include some red, like specifically a red tear coming somewhere, but he decided not to. And it feels like Ringgold is responding to his, what's the word? Hesitance by covering her painting in blood. So yeah, this is a really interesting, huge painting that you might see now in the media because it's been hung in the MoMA. So I wanted to mention, before we leave America, I wanted to mention another marginalized community, which was the Native American community. Many Native Americans were active in the civil rights movement. And contemporary Native American feminist art is now having, I suppose it's now being recognized a lot more and celebrated a lot more, because it's one of these many feminisms that's been marginalized. And Wendy Redstar is a really great example of this, and she's done loads of interviews on YouTube. She's really easy to learn more about. She annotated these photographs, which were originally taken in 1880, when the Crow community, who were a Native American community, traveled to Washington, D.C. for these big peace delegation negotiations, which were meant to try and peacefully establish the transfer of land from Native American communities to the Americans. In this case, there were many of these peace delegations, In this case, it was specifically because the president wanted to build the Pacific Railroad through Crow territory. The peace delegations often consisted of abuse, really, from the American government, where they would keep the Native American communities away from their family for as long as possible to trying to, and this is kind of on paper, hoping to instill homesickness and weakness and illness. And then they would trick them into signing documents, especially in Native communities, in a lot of Native American communities, verbal promises were really like one of the most important things. And they didn't use paper and signatures to seal deals like they did, like the American government now did. So they were tricked into signing these documents that meant nothing to them. Anyway, so it's a really horrible history and a really sad one. But Wendy Redstar really tries to make these people look as royal as they were, really. She shows that they were really wearing their best, most powerful attire. Everything they're wearing has symbolic value for the Crow community. Like this feather, for example, is a symbol to say that you went into an enemy territory and stole a horse for your family. So it's like a symbol of your bravery. Yeah, the annotations are amazing because on the one hand, they really empower the people that they represent who had been kind of flattened by these 1880 photographs. But on the other hand, they have these really sad, let me try and zoom in, facts like, my body was sold to a collector for $500 and kept for 72 years at the American Museum of Natural History. So yeah, it's a, there's so much to learn from these images, and there's a whole series, so it's definitely worth looking into. And actually, Wendy Redstar says that she made this series because she was so sick of seeing so much Native American imagery on Western advertising that really, I mean, this hopefully will remind you a bit of the Orientalist paintings that we looked at, and all these kind of stereotypes. Land, Lake Butter, this one down here, only removed this image, I think in 2020, because I've seen it on the news. So it's something that's really ongoing, and that Native American communities are still really vocal about. And there's a really great, or rather there was a really great exhibition about this at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Yeah, was it in Washington, D.C.? I think so, it's in the notes. And it says, new exhibit reveals Indians everywhere except in your textbooks. And it basically says how the US used Native Americans to try and make this, you know, more interesting American identity, but actually really wanted nothing to do with actual living Native Americans. And this is still very much the feeling. Because contemporary Native American artists like Sonny Asu are making these really interesting installations that also like parody American advertising. For example, these cereal boxes say things like, if you read them, they have Native American languages on them. It says that if you eat them, it will be a good source of trickery. This says, the government says this 100% does not contain a referendum. The total land is 14,000 hectares. So yeah, this is a very political installation about orientalizing advertising, I suppose. Yeah, one of the boxes says, this contains 12 essential lies and deception. So the light-hearted presentation is actually reveals really important social issues that the Native community had with the Americans. So yeah, there's some great contemporary Native American art, and I wanted to finish, well, not finish the class, well, we'll see. I wanted to finish the American section with this feminist work by Wendy Redstar, and it's called, I've included a title, but it's tiny, so I'll read it to you. It's called Map of the Allotted Lands of the Crow Reservation, a tribute to many good women. And I'm going to read you a summary from the artist because she explains it much better than me. So, to appreciate this work of art, a little history helps. In 1887, the US government moved to divide up and allot all tribal land, giving it to men, despite the fact that Crow, like many native societies, was a matriarchal society. The US imposed a patriarchy. The colonial map represents the imposition of patriarchal property structure to dispossess the Crow of their land. So basically what she does is photograph contemporary Crow women and paste their pictures over the lands to try and re-establish the original matrilineal system. So yeah, it's really interesting. I'm especially interested by the idea that colonialism was so often connected to the imposition of Western patriarchal norms that were sometimes really foreign to the communities that Westerners were trying to destroy, which happens in many places across the world. And in this example, it happened to the Crow community in the US. So this kind of wraps up the American feminist section. So I'm going to answer one of the questions that has come up about what we've talked about so far. Someone has asked, how does Picasso's painting fit in with the feminist movement? Is it the women in the painting in the wartime? There is a Spanish town called Guernica, which was decimated in the war. And it might be fiction, but it's based on a book I read. I think I've read that book as well. By David Bowling or something he's called. So let's go back to this painting. Because it's important to understand this painting because it's referenced so many times. Guernica is a Spanish town and it was bombed. It's not fiction. It was bombed in 1937, just before World War II. And it's because Franco, the Spanish dictator, actually, yeah, he was the dictator by that point at the time, collaborated with Hitler and Mussolini and decided to let them test some of their bombs that they would go on to use in World War II on this small town, maybe because it's in the north of Spain where Franco was getting a lot more resistance, so it was kind of in his interest to to destroy this town. And it's such an awful story because they timed it so that it was, I think it was on a Sunday, and they dropped the bombs in a market at peak market time. And it also meant, I suppose it is an important feminist history because it's important in feminist history because, you know, who in that period was going to the markets? Women. So that's why Picasso includes majority women in this painting. And it's interesting to try and read this painting with a feminist lens, as you say, because we've mentioned in other classes that Picasso seems to have had this shift where he stops seeing women as objects so much and stops painting them as such. And maybe this painting had something to do with it. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. So other questions that have come up are about black and white minstrel shows on TV and how they relate to the African American feminist movement that we've been talking about. And it's so true. This minstrel shows, which were, you know, a topic that was really unpicked by African American feminists, were totally ignored as well by the white feminist movement. And someone else has said, talking about this work about the Crow community, that the same thing happened in Colombia, which was a well-functioning, mature, matriarchal society, but when the Spanish arrived, they imposed their patriarchal values, which is, yeah, very, very sad indeed. So it's interesting. These are all really good questions. What I wanted to show you basically is that the traditional history of feminist art does begin in the US, and it does begin with Judy Chicago, but you don't have to leave the US to try and take a more intersectional approach, or even, you know, to be less fancy about it, to just learn about a history that you may not be so familiar with, because the kind of main arguments and values of white feminism, things that were radical in their day, like breaking down domesticity, taking women out of kitchens, rejecting the housewife stereotype, you know, were important in their day, but now have become mainstream and familiar, and we kind of need to get other things into the mainstream. So even if you're just curious to learn about a different type of history, like Native American history that you don't know about, yeah, you can stay in the US, and yeah, you don't have to go very far to find intersectional feminist history, is the point. I just wanted to include this image by a British feminist artist called Susana Truth, to kind of make the same point. We haven't covered any of the British feminist movements, which, to be honest, was quite similar, like, well, was related, had lots of connections with the American feminist movement. But if you wanted to learn about, you know, try a more intersectional approach to British feminist history than the traditional one, then you definitely don't have to leave the UK. And Susana Truth is a great example of this. This was one of her earliest paintings. I don't think this was made in 2006, you know. I really don't think so. I have a feeling it's like 1967 or something. No, in the 1980s. Oh yeah, I included, I'll read you, I suppose, to round this off, a short description of Susana Truth, because there's a big exhibition opening about her work, and she's involved in it because she's still alive, opening at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge next year. It's been postponed, so it's something we can all look forward to. So let me just read you the summary. Susana Truth first came to prominence as an artist in 1985 after graduating from the University of Leeds. She exhibited her large work, Housewife with Steak Knives, along with her other work, The Only Good Indian, in a groundbreaking exhibition titled The Thin Black Line, which she curated with contemporary artist Lubaina Hamid in London. The exhibition was the first of its kind that included artworks by artists, all of whom were British-based women of African and Asian parentage. So really important exhibition in 1985. And also, I wanted to mention it because it shows that Susana Truth worked with Lubaina Hamid, who we have talked about a lot in another class, who was a really important Black British artist of the British feminist movement. So yeah, you don't have to go very far to find this stuff. Now, I had, you know, despite me saying all of this, I always feel a bit sad when I've spent a whole class in the West. Oh, someone has very helpfully Googled this Susana Truth's work, and it is from 1984 to 1985, so thank you. Yeah, I had a feeling, I don't know why it says 2006, but it is correct in the notes. So Yeah, so despite the fact that you can, and you should, you know, find lots of intersectional feminist histories of art in the UK, in America, in the West, I do always feel a bit, not guilty, but I just think it's always sad when you spend a whole class based in the West with things that are more familiar and accessible to us. So I had this whole, you know, part 2 of the class about Iranian feminism, which we can't skip, to be honest. But what I think I'm going to do is do it next week. And maybe we can look next week at some examples